So, when it comes to haplogroups in prehistoric Scandinavia, what we mostly have found is I2, even though that most of the bodies we have found, and the ones that are tested, of course, only has the more archaic ancestor of both I2 and I1, which is just known as I. There's not been that many findings in general, and I think that number is about 12, 14 maybe. But I had a discussion once with a person who claimed that because of the earliest I1 that is certain has been found in Hungary, it is a later addition to the Scandinavian gene pool, if you can say it that way. But there are some things that doesn't really work with this theory, and some of that is the consistent culture of what is, for example, mentioned as the boat cult, and well, in general, the fishing and very maritime based culture. Another point that makes the wipeout of I2 very unlikely is that it is very, very fast, because several of the ones we have found is in like 4000 BC, and then 3000 BC and after, I2 is barely found. So it's, if it's in a process of an innovation, they either would have been like all I2 males at that point would either not have children at all, which is extremely unlikely, or they would just have been killed. And that doesn't really make that much sense either. There are one finding that is even older than the I1 in Hungary that shows some of the same mutations, and since none are found earlier than that one of I1 outside of Scandinavia, there is, I think it's about 5000 BC. There was one single in Sweden that was found with, it wasn't decided exactly what, because it was damaged, so they didn't want to put a label on it, but it clearly showed mutations of I1, which is, really why several people have labeled it as I1, even though it's earlier than the previous oldest sample we have of it. There's also like a few findings in a very long time span, in the sense that there's been people in Scandinavia for like 12,000 years at this point, and prior to the Bronze Age, which is where I1 appears. As said before, we have only found like 14 bodies, which is not nearly enough findings and enough samples to deduce anything at all. There was an argument that it entered with the Indo Europeans later, which is around 3000 BC, but that doesn't make sense with, for example, Satakunta in Finland, which is actually one of the areas in Scandinavia, or in the Nordics rather, that has the highest amount of I1, which is all the way up at 40%. And they also have 40% N, which is the commonly associated haplogroup with Uralics. This doesn't make sense, because R1 and RB, if I1 entered with the Indo Europeans, then this R haplogroup would be higher as well. It's worth mentioning that in Satakunta it's a Finnish majority, not a Swedish one, which can also be seen by the haplogroups. But this shows that I1 was in all of the Nordics before the advance of the Indo Europeans. Another example is like all the archaeology that is found in relation to these people, because we have theorized several things on where the Germanic substrate language hypothesis, like what the parent language comes from, what kind of culture. If there was an actual cultural shift at like introduction of farming, or even in the pre-Indo-European population during the Indo-European invasions, there is a problem with that, because then Polish and other closer related languages would also have the same kind of substrate, which they don't. So that is basically showing that it is unique to Scandinavian, and it probably is way older than even the funnel-beaker culture. This is all speculation, however, and as said, many more findings need to be actually sampled before any proper conclusion can be drawn from that. Since, again, the only I1 we have from very long time ago is in Hungary, and then the few mutations from one finding in Sweden before that.